Today we're going to be going over what I consider to be the ultimate whirlwind build for Barbarian in Diablo 4. Not only do I think it's the best whirlwind build that I've been able to make so far, but it's also one of the best builds for Barbarian in the game at the moment. And this is even after the last patch that they did, nerfing the whirlwind Barbarian. What's great about this is you can also use this build to level up. I use this throughout the majority of my playthrough so far on Barbarian, although I do believe Hammer of the Ancients might be a little bit better early game due to its better damage against single targets. But there's a few things that we can change up in this build that we'll go over that you can use for leveling. What we're going to be showcasing is geared for progression through World Tier 3 and 4, and has allowed me to solo nightmare dungeons up to level 20 since the mid-level 50s. The survivability of this build is unparalleled, and what's nice is the survivability aspects of this should transfer into other builds if you want to experiment. We're going to be focusing on upkeeping our shouts and maintaining 100% whirlwind as much as possible. Our whirlwind is going to be applying bleed, stun, vulnerability, and slow, allowing us to take advantage of multiple damage increases to get a really high output of damage continuously. We'll also be able to maintain berserking at a very high rate, which is going to increase our damage and fury generation. The first thing we're going to go over is the expertise and techniques that we're going to be focusing on. There are two weapon expertises that you can consider for your technique. If you're having problems with fury generation, I recommend the two-handed mace expertise. At level 10, it gives us a 10% chance to gain 2 fury when hitting an enemy, and with whirlwind, you're going to be hitting an enemy all the time, and you double this amount of fury gained while berserking, which we're going to be in a lot. We also deal 15% increased critical strike damage to stunned, vulnerable, and enemies while berserking, which is what this build is focused around. What's nice about applying this as your technique is it doesn't matter what weapons you're using, this will be applied to any weapon that you're using currently in your build. The other expertise that you might want to use as your technique is the polearm. At level 10, this will increase your lucky hit chance by 10%, and you deal 10% increased damage while healthy, which you're going to be at most of the time with this build. One thing you need to remember as you're progressing your Barbarian is to make sure that you're applying the right arsenal to your skills. You can open up the skill menu here, and you can scroll down, you can actually cycle through which type of weapons you want to be using. But I also played this with bludgeoning as well as slicing, so it's really going to be about what best weapons you have and what skills you have to take advantage of. This build has a ton of versatility, and you can change it depending on what your current situation is. But I'm going to be showcasing it with dual wield because there's actually something cool we can do with expertises. As my technique, I really wanted the two-handed mace expertise because of the extra fury generation and damage, and since we're dual wielding, I get the benefit of the one-handed mace expertise as well as the one-handed sword. The one-handed mace has a 10% increased damage to stunned enemies, and we double this amount if we're using 2. We're not actually using 2, but you can. And as our bonus, we get up to a 10% chance to gain berserking for 1.5 seconds when you hit a stunned enemy. Now we also gain the benefit of the one-handed sword, so we get a 10% chance to gain 5 fury when hitting a crowd control enemy, and killing a crowd control enemy grants 15% increased attack speed for 3 seconds. Now what's great is I could use 2 maces or 2 swords, but I like having the benefit of both of these at the same time right now. The main goal of this is to have as much fury as possible, while also stacking as many different things as we can to have a consistent high damage output. Now before we go over the skill tree, we're going to go over what I think is even more important, the actual legendary aspects and the stat allocation that you're going to be using on your weapons and armor. This is incredibly important for actually min-maxing your build and getting the most damage out of it, because if you have the wrong stats on your weapons and armor, you're going to be doing considerably less damage. One of the most important aspects for this is going to be the aspect of dire whirlwind. This increases whirlwind's critical strike chance by 14% for each second it's channeled, up to 42%. This is one of the main reasons why I have the plus 44 critical strike damage on this weapon. I could cycle out the ultimate skill damage because we're not going to be using that, and I also have the 49% damage to close enemies because with whirlwind we're going to be very close. Now this ultimate skill damage I would hope I would turn into something like damage to slowed enemies, which we'll get into why very soon, or something like damage while berserking or vulnerability damage. You're going to want to make sure to put this aspect on a two-handed weapon so you get the double bonus. On my other two-handed weapon, I have this aspect here, which has whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, you inflict 54% of the base damage dealt as additional bleeding damage over 5 seconds. Bleeding is actually really important to this build, because when we go over our ability tree, we're actually going to be applying slow and stun to anything that is bleeding. This is also a pretty significant damage increase. The next most important part of this build is actually this unique item called Temerity. This has an effect on it that anytime you heal yourself beyond 100% life, it grants you a barrier up to 72% of your maximum life that lasts for 8 seconds. With this build, we're going to be continuously regenerating health at all times, which means we're going to be proccing this almost all the time that we're doing damage. You're essentially only going to be using your potions to top up your life so that you can easily get your barrier back. This unique item might be one of the most important things for Barbarian survivability that I've found so far in the game. If you combine this with another aspect like damaging an elite enemy grants you a barrier absorbing up to 1554 damage for 10 seconds, you can have a massive barrier up at all times that most enemies can't even break through. Now, since we're going to have a barrier up most of the time, having the aspect that deals increased damage while you have a barrier active is incredibly important. Mine only has 17 because I found it earlier in the game, but make sure to replace this as you find better and stronger ones. Now, since we're going to be applying bleeding to enemies, our other weapon has stunning a bleeding enemy deals 32% of their total bleeding amount to them as physical damage. And then we also have on our necklace, direct damage against bleeding enemies has up to a 42% chance to stun them for 2 seconds. This stun can be really important for additional spike damage. Now, the skills on our rings are probably some of the most important. Whenever you cast a shout skill, its cooldown is reduced by 1.7 seconds per nearby enemy up to a maximum of 6 seconds. This is going to drastically increase the amount of uptime we can have for our shouts. And I also have another skill that I've been messing around with a lot that pairs with this really well. This is actually on the unique item called Rage of Harogoth. This has a lucky hit up to a 36% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your non-ultimate skills by 1.5 seconds when you inflict bleeding on elites. Since we're going to be inflicting bleeding on pretty much everything we touch, when you fight large packs of elites, this is going to be incredibly powerful for keeping your shouts up almost all the time. And as you scale up to higher and higher difficulties, there's going to be more and more elites, which means this is only going to get better as you progress through the game. On our other ring, we have your shout skills generate 3 fury per second while active. This ties in really well with the aspect we have in our glove, which is each point of fury you generate while at maximum fury grants your next core skill 2% increased damage up to 30%. This means once you get the full stacks, you can reactivate Whirlwind and get that full 30% bonus. This aspect is only good when you can generate enough fury to take advantage of it. It could be argued that at some point both of these could be replaced by something that provides you with more defensive capabilities, but that's going to completely depend on your playstyle. Then the last item we have on our boots, which is also arguably replaceable if you want, is Whirlwind periodically pulls enemies to you. This is going to group up everything around you to get it as close as possible to apply all of your effects and statuses to them, allowing you to increase your damage. While not necessary, it's quite nice to have. I do have 2 chest pieces that I use, and also this skill could be put on one of the other replaceable aspects. And it's also really important because damaging an enemy with a core skill has up to a 24% chance to extend the duration of berserking by 1 second. Double this duration if it was a critical strike. This can give us significantly increased uptime to our berserking, so it could be argued that any of these other skills could be replaced by it because it is incredibly useful. It's going to be up to your discretion when and where you actually put this aspect, but it is incredibly good. Now finally, let's get into the skill tree, and there's a couple different things you can do in here depending on your situation. I've got 1 point into lunging strike for our basic skill, and then enhanced lunging strike and combat lunging strike to try and get us into berserking. Then for our core skill, we're obviously going to be using Whirlwind, and I put 5 into this. I have 2 extra from my gloves. Then we have Enhanced Whirlwind, which gains 1 fury each time Whirlwind deals direct damage to an enemy, or 4 to elites. And then this is where you can change it up. If you need more bleed because you don't have it anywhere else in your build, you can use Furious Whirlwind, that while using a slashing weapon, because we have a sword and a mace, Whirlwind also inflicts 40% of its base damage as bleeding damage over 5 seconds. Or you can choose to go with Violent Whirlwind, which after Whirlwind for 2 seconds, it deals 30% increased damage until it's cancelled. Both of these are viable depending on what you want to do. I then have 3 points into Pressure Point, so lucky hit your core skills have up to a 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. Since we're making sure our weapons add to our vulnerability damage, and it already gives us a 20% increased damage increase, this is not only going to benefit you, but anybody you're playing with as well. And then for our defensive skills, I have Rallying Cry. I put 1 point in here, and I have 2 extra from my armor. Then Enhanced Rallying Cry for getting unstoppable, and Tactical Rallying Cry for additional fury and resource generation. I then have 1 point into Challenging Shout, 2 extra from my armor. Then Enhanced Challenging Shout to gain 20% maximum life, and then while Challenging Shout is active, you gain 3 Fury each time you take damage. For our brawling skills, I have 1 point into Warcry, and then 1 point into Enhanced Warcry to get into Berserking for 4 seconds. You could use an additional point to get into Power Warcry if you want, but I felt like the point was better used elsewhere. I then have 3 points into Booming Voice to increase our skill effect duration. And then I have a Raid Leader. Your shouts also heal allies for 3% of their maximum life per second. It's debatable if this one is actually needed or not. I also have 2 points into Aggressive Resistance to gain 6% damage reduction while berserking. I'd like to have 3 points in here, which I'll get as I level up more areas on the world map. Under Weapon Mastery, I'm using 3 points of Pit Fighter, which deals 9% increased damage to close enemies and 6% distant damage reduction. Then 3 points into Slaying Strike to deal 23% increased damage against injured enemies, which are below 35% of their life. And then I've got 3 points into No Mercy, plus 2 from my armor, which has a 15% increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. This is really important, because we're also spec'd into 1 point of Hamstring, which our bleeding effects slow enemies by 10%, which means we're always slowing everything, which means we're always getting this bonus of No Mercy. For our ultimate skill, we are spec'd into Wrath of the Berserker, and then we've gone all the way down into Supreme Wrath of the Berserker. Depending on your armor and your ranks with your expertises, it could be argued that you could eventually spec out of Wrath of the Berserker into something else, but once again, that's going to be up to your playstyle. I also have Tempered Fury, which increases our maximum Fury by 3, but that was just to get into Invigorating Fury, which heals for 9% of your maximum life for each 100 Fury spent. Very important. And then for our key passive, I'm spec'd into Unconstrained. This increases Berserk's maximum duration by 5 seconds and increases its damage bonus by 25%. I really like this because occasionally we can proc a lot of additional Berserk, so being able to stack that higher and get an increased damage bonus is really nice.